Good afternoon, team. We'll be starting shortly. The class starts at 2 o'clock, so we're just waiting for more people to jump on. I see all the remarks that are coming in, so thank you. Awesome, Esther. Thank you for being on the training. So we'll start in a few more minutes, okay?
Memories bring back you. There's a time I remember when I did not know pain, when I believed in forever, everything stayed the same. Now my heart feels like December when somebody say your name. As I didn't try to call you, but I'm not alone. Yeah, everybody hurts sometimes, everybody hurts someday. Hey, hey, everything will be alright. Gonna raise a glass and say, hey, here's to the ones that we got. Here's to the wish you were here, but you're not. It's the things bring back all the memories of everything we've been through. Those are the ones here today. Those are the ones that are lost on the way. It's the things bring back all the memories. And the memories bring back memories bring back you. There's a time that I remember when feelings got so low, when I felt erased, was it before the storm? Now my heart feels like a river, and it's like a burn. I'll carry the torches for you, but you know not to draw. Yeah, everybody hurts sometimes, everybody hurts someday. Hey, hey, but everything will be alright. Gonna raise a glass and say, hey, here's to the ones that we got. tonight is a dream, bring back old memories of everything we've been through. Those are the ones here tonight. Those are the ones that are lost on the way, 'cause the dreams bring back old memories, and the memories bring back memories, bring back memories bring back memories bring back yeah, no. Memories bring back you. Why should
Okay, good afternoon, KW South Bay. It is 2 o'clock. So every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, we will have a contract case study class lecture for all of you. So today what I'd like to talk to you about is liquidated damages. Now, this is a sensitive situation that I can tell you a lot of real estate agents unfortunately do not understand the initial process of what liquidated damages and the provision that this holds. What are the damages that entails from a buyer standpoint, but what are the damages that the seller also incurs? Because it can go both ways. It could be a buyer, it could be a seller. So this will give you a perspective of how to handle the provision, which is clearly reflects on the RPA. So as people are jumping on, so let me just admit as we proceed on with liquidated damage provision. So I have such a passion for this. One is, as a previous broker, I understand that there is dispute sometimes. You know, it doesn't go the direction that the buyer or the seller wants. And now there's frustration. There is sometimes even anger. And now they're going after the buyer's deposit. Now there's certain things that have to happen before the initial deposit can be ultimately claimed by the seller. And those conditions are very simple. If you understand the legality of the RPA, the purchase agreement. So in order for a seller to obtain any type of damages, the buyer has to release any and all contingencies. So I'll definitely explore that more as we progress in our segue here. So our topic for today is going to be liquidated damage, okay, which is a phenomenal paragraph on the purchase agreement. So what is liquidated damages? Liquidated damages is a contractual agreement upon the buyer will owe the seller in the event that the buyer breaches the contract, okay? So meaning when the buyer doesn't go through with it, then ultimately there may be recourse that the seller may go after some or all the deposit, okay? But in order for the seller to be awarded the deposit, there has to be a breach from the buyer, okay? And I'll give you some case study scenarios and how that is accomplished. So liquidated damage provision is a provision that's on the purchase agreement. So let's go and compare to what is actual damages versus liquidated damages. Actual damages are the actual loss suffered by a non-breach party, often a specified amount for a receipt or invoice. So basically when there is actual damages, let's say that the buyer submitted an offer, offer got accepted, you're in escrow, and now the buyer is doing their due diligence, right? And after doing their home inspections, any additional inspections, buyer puts in a request of repairs that says, hey, you know, this roof is really bad, and we are requesting as a condition to continue moving forward that the seller take care of that roof. The seller agrees to the terms and says, no problem. If this is something that you are requesting and we can continue the process, then I'll go ahead and take care of the roof. And let's say that the roof was estimated at a $10,000 cost. The buyer submits the home inspections, the invoice to that home roofing company, and the seller decides to use that company. Seller does it, part of the agreement, folks, that in order for this to satisfy the buyer, it has to be completed 5 days prior to close of escrow, if that's the agreement. Now, if this is a 30-day escrow, a roof can be a challenge, okay? Right now, especially with a lot of contractors backed up and there's so much work to be done that it can be possibly be done in 3 to 5 days, you know, if you find the right roofer to do so, depending on the size of the roof and the severity of the roof itself, okay? But regardless of what the situation is, if the seller agrees to and does the work, and then ultimately now provides the buyer with the receipt of completion. They completed the work, brand new roof, maybe some plywood was installed as well. Everything is good. Here's the invoice that gives the buyer the right that the roof is completely done. And now 2 or 3 days later, the buyer comes back and says, you know what? I've had a change in heart. I don't think I want to move forward with the purchase of this home. Okay. And that can happen, ladies and gentlemen. That can actually happen where the seller did the work, buyer put a request, buyer decides to back out, and now who has this bill? Well, the seller, because the seller was the one that put up the cost to do so, either through the proceeds of the sale of the home or through out of pocket, where they gave $10,000 to the roofing company to get the roof taken care of. Regardless, that's what we call actual damages. Now, liquidated damages, it's a contractual agreement upon estimate of the actual damages. And that's where we define the difference between actual damages and liquidated damages, which the RPA clearly defines that the buyer and the seller can have a dispute, and ultimately there may be some type of damages involved. Liquidated damage are the rules. Must be a reasonable estimate. So it cannot be a ridiculous amount. So this is what I need you to understand, folks, that the RPA, and this is where I see a lot of agents not comprehend how this all works, the dynamics of how the RPA works. So I just want to give you some clarity in how to approach these conversations with the buyer and with the seller, because they're both in this agreement together for the remainder of a 30-day escrow. But if there is a situation or a dispute or a disagreement, then ultimately who incurred what? And this is where we define liquidated damages and how the contract works. The liquidated damages are also the amount actually paid. And how it works is on a residential up to 4 units, where buyer intends to occupy the property. And I want you to understand this very clear, that it states that in order for a seller to be able to retain some damages based on the rules of the 3%, the buyer has to occupy the property. 3% or less is presumed. The provision must be separately signed and initialed, meaning that if there's anything above the 3% deposit, let's just say, theoretically speaking, you're submitting an offer on $1 million. The listing agent is asking you to put 3% of good faith deposit, which coordinates to a $30,000 deposit. But let's say that the buyer is aggressively wanting this property and ups the deposit from $30,000 to now $50,000. There is a $20,000 difference, right, from the 30%, or excuse me, the 3%, which is the $30,000, and then the $20,000 that the buyer initially put as more into the deposit in good faith. Well, that $20,000 has to be a separate agreement, and I'll explain as we go through the course of how that works, and ultimately how you protect both parties, the buyer and also the seller. Number 5, the provision must be 10-point bold type, or in red 8-point bold type, when multiple payments, and I'll explain that as we progress through the PowerPoint. Okay, in order to satisfy 1, 2, and 3, and also each payment must be satisfied on 4 and 5. Okay. So here on paragraph 21B as in boy, under section liquidated damages, okay? So there's 2 clauses to this, section A, section B. We're not going to worry about section 8 of 21. So when you hear someone say 21B, that indicates, they're talking about liquidated damages, okay? I'm going to switch real quick to the actual RPA. This is the RPA here, ladies and gentlemen, and here it is. Section 21, B as in boy, liquidated damages, which is the remedies for a buyer who breaches the contract. And I want you to understand that this is just one paragraph of 34 different categories on the RPA. But once you understand the dynamics and how these work and how they function, it makes you a more diligent agent to basically articulate your conversations to ultimately win the fight, okay? And I'll explain what I mean, not necessarily fighting, but ultimately strong-arming the opposing agent and the argument. It's like a defense attorney. You got a prosecution and you have a defense attorney, and both are trying to discredit one or the other. Now, the contract is in black and white. So if you understand the levels of paragraphs, then it gives you a more concise anchor to ultimately argue your position, okay? No difference when you're in court. So what I wanted to just show you, this is on the RPA under liquidated damages, and both buyer and seller have to initiate this, okay? And if they don't, you need to reinforce it by saying, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you know, we are missing the liquidated damage provision, because that protects the buyer as well as much as it does the seller. And I'll explain it in further details, okay? So liquidated damage provision. I'm going to say exactly verbatim of what it states, so that way you get a good understanding of what this provision really entails. If buyer fails to complete the purchase because of buyer's default, it doesn't say seller, it says buyer's default, seller shall, and that's the key, shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean when they say actually paid? It means whatever is in escrow. If there is $5,000 in escrow, if there's $10,000, $30,000, that's what we call actual. If the property is a dwelling, now there is stipulations, ladies and gentlemen, that I want you to clearly understand. If the property is a dwelling with no more than 4 units, meaning if it's an SFR, single family residence, a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex, this provision falls under that category. So let me ask you this question. Does this fall under 5 units? No, because that's not what this RPA shows. Then you have to transition into a commercial purchase agreement, not the RPA, but a commercial, okay? And we'll talk about that at a later date. So the property has to be a single dwelling. Is a manufactured home qualify as a single dwelling? The answer is yes, it does, okay? This includes manufactured homes. This includes mobile homes as well, okay? So one of which the buyer intends to occupy the property. So what does that mean? What does that state? That means that these are the elements that have to incur in order for this liquidated damage provision to work. So one, it has to be a dwelling of no more than 4 units. It has to be a buyer who is intending to occupy the property, okay? And then next, the amount retained shall be no more than 3%, meaning that that's the maximum cap that a seller can go after from breach of contract from the buyer, okay? So that 3% of the purchase price, not 3% that they put, but 3% that they put based on the purchase price. So going back to my theory, if you submit an offer of $1 million, 3% of 3% of $1 million is $30,000. So if you have been submitting offers, what you have seen is counter offers, where the listing agent is requiring the buyer to put in a maximum of 3% of good faith deposit. And that's pretty norm right now on what we're seeing, because right now what we're seeing is a seller's market, right? Very low inventory, tons of buyers. So the buyers are basically in the mercy of the seller, because now they're competing with other offers on the table. So now it's really the seller's discretion and choice. Now you can put whatever deposit your clients are putting as a request, but if the counter offer or the MLS shows that your offer will be considered if you're at least putting 3%, then you got to abide by that. If not, what's going to happen? You're probably not going to get your offer accepted. Okay, so keep that in mind. Please keep that in mind. The next sentence, it says, any access shall be returned to the buyer, except as provided in paragraph 14H. Release of funds will require mutual, another key component, guys. Mutual agreement. What does that mean? What does that say? It means that both buyer, both seller have to mutually agree to release it. Just because the buyer has breached the contract doesn't necessarily mean that the money will be given to the seller. There's a lot of obstacles and walls that ultimately get to the avenue where the seller can go after the buyer's deposit, and I'll explain that as we progress as well. So key elements is single family up to 4 units. The buyer has to occupy the property or a property of the 4 units involved. And then the amount shall not be more than 3% of the purchase of price. So what I'm doing, ladies and gentlemen, is giving you a defined understanding and how to have these conversations with the listing agent. Because I can tell you from personal experience that there's a lot of agents that do not understand a lot of the components to the RPA. They go with the motions of filling in the blanks, but do they really know the core and dissect these contracts? And this is where you're going to be an efficient agent that understands the totality of the RPA, because now you can have those conversations and explain to it, I have to disagree with you, Mr. or Mrs. Listing Agent, but defined based on the RPA of paragraph 21B says this otherwise, okay? So when you have an understanding, you're more confident in your position. Now you're being able to protect your client, either the buyer or the seller, when you understand the elements of the paragraphs on this RPA. So I want you to just have a big understanding that this is a benefit not just to you, but this is a benefit to your clients, because God forbid something happens and you ultimately advised your clients, buyer releases any and all contingencies, and now the buyer's deposit is exposed. Now the buyer's deposit is in jeopardy. And what if there's $20,000, $25,000 of buyer's good deposit? Okay, you don't want to be in that position. That's a very stressful position to be. So I'm just giving you some insights, some ideas, some techniques that you can use to protect your client to achieve the ultimate goal. Either if the buyer has to retract and cancel, they cancel with the understanding that they're getting their deposit back. Or, progression, that they're so deep into this escrow that they are bound of losing their deposit or moving forward with the purchase of the home. And that, again, falls on your client. But giving good advice will definitely give your clients peace of mind, okay? So going back, the release of the funds will require mutual agreement, meaning that not just the seller agrees to it, the buyer has to agree to it as well, or vice versa. Both principals have to agree in order for this to be bound, or binding agreement, I should say. All right, so sign release instructions, okay? Another key element, a sign release instruction from both buyer and seller, decision or arbitration award at the time, and these are in cap. And the reason they're in cap is because this is what you have to understand as an agent, as a buyer, and as a seller, because the buyer and the seller are initialing these forms. And by initialing these forms, what they're saying to you is, Simon, Sophia, Max, Monica, Debbie, whoever's on this call, you agree and you understand what you just signed. You agree and you understand. You agree to the terms, but you also understand what you're reading. Because they cannot come back to you and say, well, Simon, I didn't know what I was signing. Okay, well, if you didn't understand what you were signing, why did you initial? Why did you sign in this agreement? Well, because you told me to. And they're going to try to throw it back at you. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we had a conversation based on this, that what liquidated damages provision really entails. Okay. If you had any questions, then we shouldn't have you sign this until we had a clear, concise understanding. Okay. And we'll explore that as we progress with this. Okay. So sign release instruction from both buyer and seller, and the decision on an arbitration award, because they can get escalated. There's different categories. There's what we call mediation. Then there's called arbitration. First that you want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is you want to mediate this before it escalates to an arbitration. What is mediation? Mediation is basically having a neutral party hear the argument and ultimately help both the buyer and the seller come to a conclusion. And whatever conclusion that is, to release the deposit to the seller, not to release the deposit to the seller, release the deposit back to the buyer. There has to be a understanding and a mutual agreement to that. That's what mediation is. An arbitration is similar to a lawsuit, small claims. There's a panelist, a retired judge or attorney that will listen to the case. You'll have the opportunity to do your opening statement, your cross-examination, and then your final end conclusion of why you're entitled to that deposit. And we'll explore that a little bit more. Because an arbitration is no different than going to court in front of a judge and having a jury basically hear your case. But it's on a smaller scale, not that expensive, and it's usually done at the association where the person that is arbitrating this has 3 panelists that are listening to the case, and you as an agent or your client as a principal get to plead their case. If you're representing the buyer will plead their case. If you're representing the seller will plead their case. And ultimately, a decision is made, not at the moment, maybe within 20 to 48 hours, they'll send you either an email or a letter concluding to their results. And if that doesn't work, then ultimately getting attorneys involved and then fighting over that, but that can be costly as well. So those are the parameters of what a mediation arbitration means. And then obviously the breach of contract, because it's not just breaching from a buyer's perspective, it's also breach of seller. What if the seller doesn't perform? Then the seller's in breach of the contract. But here's the big picture. Who has more skin in the game? Okay, who has more skin in the game? Well, it really depends. It really depends. What does it depend on? Many factors. Yeah, the buyer has a deposit in escrow, and that can be a $20,000 deposit, but doesn't mean that the buyer is the only one that has damages. What if the seller did the work and the work was $30,000 and was ultimately going to get that back on their net proceeds from the sale of the house? And because the buyer does not perform and has breached the contract, $30,000 is money that the seller did not have to incur, but did it in good faith in order for the buyer to continue with the process. So either party gets to also be in a position they don't want to be, ladies and gentlemen. So I want you to understand that these breach of contracts can go either way, either way. At the time of the increased deposit, buyer and seller shall sign a separate liquidated damage provision incorporating the increased deposit as liquidated damage, which is form RID, R-I-D, okay? And I'll explain with that form. I can tell you a lot of people, or excuse me, a lot of agents do not know about this additional form. What is a RID? What is an RID form? Okay, and we'll explain that as we move forward. All right, here's some practice notes, okay, that I want you to understand. Liquidated damage, limit to deposit actually paid. No deposit, no liquidated damages. So here's the thing, okay, very simple. If a buyer goes into escrow but never puts a deposit and ultimately breaches the contract, the seller cannot say, well, I've been damaged. Well, if you sign the RPA, you're signing to the terms of the RPA. It's unfortunate that the seller lost money when they should have requested that the buyer put some deposit in escrow, what we call skin in the game, right? And I've seen transactions where there's hardly any money in escrow. And that's, again, could be a red flag. Now, it may be a win for the buyer because the buyer doesn't have much to lose, but there has to be a mutual meeting of the minds and an understanding between both parties. If the seller's fine with it, then the seller's fine. But the seller cannot go back and sue the buyer for $20,000 of damages when there was never $25,000 in escrow. So liquidated damages, the difference between actual and liquidated damages is that if there is no liquidated damages in escrow, then there is no money that the seller can go after. Now, remember, the first or the second slide that I had, it had what are actual damages and then what are liquidated damages. Now, the seller can come back and says, well, I actually lost money because I took the buyer's belief that he wanted to buy my property, and therefore, in order for this to work, he wanted the roof to be completely done before we closed. So now the seller may have some recourse. But again, here's the bigger picture. The buyer can go to court and says, well, the distinguishes between both can be questionable, Your Honor. One is the provision doesn't say actual, it says liquidated damages. The seller was in agreement that I was only going to put $500 in deposit, and therefore I'm okay having him take my $500. Okay, that's the stipulation. When the judge sees it, they're going to say, well, you know what, you're right. You're absolutely right. They're going to go, the judge is going to see the seller and says, well, seller, why did you do those repairs? There's still no guarantee until it officially closes. Well, I took the buyer's word. Well, verbal never holds water, ladies and gentlemen. It's what's actual agreed upon on the offers. If he would have had something signed, then by all means, there you go. Now you just exposed. Now the seller has recourse to go after more money. Okay? And I always say this, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So keep this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, for the people that are on this call. Okay? Make sure that you document everything you do. Documentation will save you from a potential claim down the line, because you cannot remember what you did 2-3 weeks ago, let alone a transaction that you closed 5-6 a year ago, and now that comes up. But what you can do is actually remember based on the file, I do remember now. I remember having this conversation, because you have something that you documented, and now it kind of resonates and reminds you. That's what happened. Number 2, 3 is the cap. If deposit is 3% or less, seller gets deposit actually paid. If deposit is over 3%, seller gets 3% and must return the overage unless seller can provide validity of excess. If they can articulate the reason why they can go after more of the 3%. And I'll explain that in further detail as we progress with the slide, okay? So what's the cap? 3%, okay? So let me just say, on a $1 million listing, you're representing the buyer, you submit the offer, and you're submitting an offer at $1 million. But you're only putting $10,000 as good faith deposit, okay? And the listing agent looks and presents the offer to the seller, and the seller is perfectly fine. Let's accept. If the seller signs and executes the purchase agreement, it's a binding agreement, meaning that the seller agrees to the terms of the offer. So it's $10,000, 3% of the purchase price. The answer is no. No, it's not. So what do you do to challenge that? What you do is you have to send a seller counteroffer. And on that counteroffer, that's when you're going to state the fact, if you're representing the seller, that buyer shall put in a 3% deposit. Now you just clarified that the maximum that the seller can go after for damages is 3%. Okay, now let's turn the tables around. What if now what we're doing is this, where the 3% of $1 million is 30,000, but the buyer is putting 100,000 in good faith deposit. Okay, 100,000. That means that $70,000 is an overage. Okay, that's the overage of the 3%. What happens to that 70,000 if the buyer breaches the contract? Very simple. The overage ultimately goes back to the buyer. The damages is the 30,000. The overage goes back to the buyer. Basically, they clean their hands, cancel of escrow. Both buyer and seller mutually cancel, and everyone goes their way. Now, $30,000 is a lot of money, ladies and gentlemen, and I don't know who is in that position to just release, $30,000. This is why you got to be very careful in how you approach these conditions. This is the reason we have timelines. This is the reason we have conditions. These are the reasons we have terms on the RPA that instructs the buyer, instructs the seller of what needs to happen. That's simple. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, ladies and gentlemen. The wheel is there. You just got to listen to what the RPA shows. When you start altering these agreements, that's when you start putting both the buyer and the seller and yourself in risk. Be careful. Be very careful. Okay. Let's continue, and then I'll leave it up for some questions after my presentation. Okay, if anyone has any questions, I will open it up for you to ask me any questions regarding liquidated damage provision. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the CAR form RID. What is RID? RID is an increased deposit of liquidated damage addendum. So it's increase of whatever the actual 3% is in escrow. So the RID form is used when the buyer increases the deposit. The RID includes optional liquidated damage clause, and I'll explain to you in further with the actual form. Without this form, increased deposits are not subject to the liquidated damage provision. I love contracts, because it's like a crystal ball. It's like a crystal ball where you can see things, and it just gives you those aha moments. It's like, it makes sense. I love what this does. Because again, what are you doing? You're positioning your client, regardless of who it is, the buyer or the seller. It's like playing chess. It's like playing checkers. If you know and understand how these dynamic contracts work, and you got a good handle on it, then you become that rock star agent that understands how to protect your client. Okay, so I can tell you from personal experience, there's a lot of agents that don't know about this RID form. Okay, but it's a form that you must know if you're going to be submitting offers, especially right now when we're dealing with these low inventory days. Okay, with very low inventory of homes, tons of buyers. You got to be creative, and you got to find avenues of solution to get your foot in, okay? The dynamics of what you're seeing right now in the real estate realm, okay? How do you approach your offer to be an offer considered? How do you approach your offer to get your offer accepted? Again, you got to practice, you got to understand, but you ultimately have to have conversations with the listing agent. You got to get as much intel on that. All right. The CAR form counteroffer language, paragraph 1A, when trying to include liquidated damage back into the contract, have all parties go back and initial in the purchase agreement. So these are situations where if an offer is submitted and you represent the seller and the listing agent catches and says, oh gosh, the buyer failed to initial, or the buyer or the seller failed to initial this. Because remember, what does it have to create? It has to create a binding agreement. And if there's not a binding, even the initials on that paragraph is not binding. The contract may be binding, but that provision and paragraph, if it's not initialed by either or, then it doesn't include as part of and incorporate part of the liquidated damages. So be very careful. How you protect your clients is very simple. Have them sign an initial. That's how you protect your clients. Number 2, seller should return the purchase agreement with a counter offer so buyer knows if it's been initialed. Seller should check that the box accepting the purchase, the purchase agreement is subject to attach counter offer, and that's very simple. We're going to flip the hats for a minute, okay? We're going to get ourselves from being a buyer's agent to now a listing agent. You're getting offers, and part of your responsibility, ladies and gentlemen, is for you to understand it and read these offers. You should be having one of these, a marker, okay? Why? Because I'm old school, and this still is very effective. Anytime an offer would come, I would always, let the agents know that anything that has been in the terms of that purchase agreement, you want to highlight. You want to make sure that the offer, the purchase price is highlighted, the terms are highlighted, the down payment is highlighted. Any contingencies that they're asking for more or less are highlighted. What is the buyer requesting? What is the buyer requesting that the seller does? I'm going to highlight everything. Why? Because I do not want to miss anything that I catch myself down the line after the offer was accepted. Shoot, I forgot about paragraph 31, section B. The buyer failed to include the provision of liquidated damages. So how do you protect yourself? You do a counteroffer that says that this is a offer subject to the counteroffer that the buyer must sign, must initial paragraph 21B. Okay. I hope this stuff is good. Hope you're enjoying today's class. All right, so what if there's a dispute? Okay, is there disputes in real estate transaction? Yeah, all the time. You want all your transactions to go as smooth as possible, right? We all want that. We all want smooth transactions, but unfortunately, that's not reality. Reality is you are going to come across bumps and bruises, where you're going to have some phenomenal closings and not so phenomenal closings, meaning that there may be a dispute between the principals. What if the seller, what if the buyer won't release the deposit? Okay. Then there is additional forms that you can utilize for the effectiveness of your position. And this is where I say to you, when you understand contracts, you understand disclosures, you understand the addendums and everything that is utilized in your arsenal of tools, you become more efficient, but you become the expert in your position. So if a buyer or a seller does not release the deposit, and it doesn't matter who the money is going to, if the buyer is requesting that the seller release the deposit back to the buyer, or the seller is requesting the buyer to release the deposit back to the buyer or to the seller, okay? There's an additional form, and that form is called the buyer, it's called the BDD form, the demand for deposit for contingency cancellation, okay? That's form B as in boy, D as in David, D as in David. Seller car form letter SDD is the demand for deposit buyer failure to close, okay? So how does this work? Who uses what form? And I know it's so confusing. You're probably saying, gosh, Simon, all these forms, I'm going bananas here. What do I do? How do I utilize it? Well, you can always reach the broker, okay? So one, the broker is always there to guide you, support you, and answer any of your contract classes, okay? We have a phenomenal broker that understands the complexity of these forms. So reach out to our broker and, ask them, well, I'm in a little dilemma. What do I utilize? There you go. He'll guide you on the right form to use. But for the sake of class and time frame that we have, the buyer in the seller form is very simple. When the buyer is requesting a demand of the deposit, what the buyer is saying is, hey, seller, we canceled and I'm entitled to my deposit back, okay? Even if it is the breach of the seller and the buyer has not released contingencies, then the buyer may be entitled to get back their deposit. Now, the seller form is the seller form that is given to the buyer and the buyer's agent. And that's the demand for the deposit because the buyer failed to close. Now, these forms are only utilized when there's a breach, meaning when the buyer breaches the contract, okay? Meaning, or when the seller breaches the contract. And I'll explain how that works. Let's just say that the buyer released any and all contingencies, any and all. They have released physical inspections, disclosures, appraisal, loan contingency, and now the seller and the listing agent have sent you the contingency removal form, which is better known as the CR form. And the buyer signs off on releasing any and all contingencies, meaning everything. And then the buyer breaches the contract and says, listen, you know what, I had a change of heart. I do not want to proceed with this. I want to cancel. Okay. You can't stop that from happening. Okay. If the buyer chooses to cancel, it is up to the agent to try to, find out the reason for it, because now the buyer is in risk of jeopardizing their deposit. And now the seller has recourse, ladies and gentlemen, over that deposit. So the seller may say, fine, you know what, send me the cancellation and then we'll instruct escrow to release the deposit to the seller. And if there's a $30,000 deposit, and that's the maximum, then, if the buyer is okay with it, then the seller is entitled to the 3% of the deposit, okay? But I want you to also understand, one thing, ladies and gentlemen, that the language doesn't say that the seller can go after 3%. It says up to 3%, okay? Because $30,000 on $1 million purchase is a lot of money. And if the seller doesn't have reasonable, what's the word I was going to try to use here? Reasonable proof that there's been $30,000 of damages, the buyer can ultimately challenge that, okay? And the buyer can definitely say, look, you know what, in all due respect, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I understand that I broke the I broke the contract. I am in breach. I did release all contingencies, but I don't think $30,000 worth. So how does the buyer and the buyer agent handle that situation? Very simple. Ask the listing agent and the seller what damages were, what damages did the seller incur? Well, they incurred the roof, which was $10,000. Okay, what else? Well, they also took time off from work. Okay, well, the sellers know that they're selling their property. I don't think that's a real good reason. We're going to dispute that. Okay, well, the seller also fixed all the little requests from the buyer. Okay, how much was that? That was about $2,200. Okay, that's fair. What else? Well, the mortgage, you know, we were supposed to close in 30 days. Now my client is, my client has to pay another mortgage payment, which, you know, we were scheduled to close and then part of the proceeds was going to pay off the loan. And now they incur that. Okay, that's a good argument. Okay, so $3,500. Okay, what else? Well, that's it. All right, so my calculation says that it's about $14,500. Okay, there you go. $13,000 or $14,000 is what the damages that the seller incurred. So now you can say and instruct escrow, release $14,000 to the seller, the rest to the buyer. Well, Simon, wait a minute. 3% is $30,000 based on the contract. You're supposed to release the $30,000 to the seller. Well, yes and no. The contract defines that it says up to, doesn't say release 3%, it says up to 3%. There's an aha moment for all of you on the call, folks, okay? That if you understand the contracts, then there's no reason why you cannot challenge them. Everything can be challenged as long as you are aggressive in your approach and you understand the contracts. I don't want you to be aggressive when you don't understand the contract. Be aggressive because you understand the contract. That puts you in a better position and you look like a hero, okay? So if the seller definitely incurs major damages, then yeah. And the seller can say, no way, Jose. Okay, I hope there's no Jose on this call, but let's just say that the seller says, no, I am not in agreement to that. I want the full $30,000. And I demand that to be released to me because I gave this buyer the opportunity to buy my home. And because at no fault to me, why am I not getting any type of damages? And that's a legitimate position to be. I get it. But if the buyer is not in agreement to that, then ultimately it gets escalated to a mediation. Because escrow is not going to release the money just because the contract says. The escrow company will only release when there is mutual agreement between all parties. That's simple. That's simple. Okay, and if the buyer is okay, then by all means, bye-bye to the deposit. But if the buyer disputes that, then hey, that's going to stop and that can delay the process. Here's the give and take of the scenario. And this is why I have a passion for negotiations, because once you understand the dynamics, you can ultimately find an avenue of solution. There's always a solution to every matter. Write this down. There's always a solution to every matter. You got to think outside the box and be creative in your approach, because here's the thing. Agents see things from the inside looking out, where people that are very good with their contracts see things from the outside looking in. They have a better parameter in how they can see. They're 2 steps ahead of the game. This is why you see agents close more deals, because they know how to navigate these contracts. And then you see agents that are not so good and they ultimately fall short. This is where your skill set comes into play, ladies and gentlemen. This is why these classes are crucial in your position. I want you to get more offers accepted. I want you to close more deals. I want you to get more listings, okay? That's the end goal, right? Your goal is to close, make money. But if you don't understand the dynamics when something hits the fan, right, then that's going to be 2 steps back instead of 2 steps forward. So I want you to understand how to work the contract, okay? All right, let me continue. Okay, here's some practice notes. So sample letter on the BDD and the SDD, the demand of release of the deposits, have provided a deadline and explains that a $1,000 penalty be awarded in addition to the deposit, okay? So on the form, and I think it's on page 1, 2, 3, I think it's on page 3 of the RPA on the very bottom. On the very bottom of the RPA, it shows, and I'll probably show you on the RPA right now, but it shows that if there is any type of resistment, then you know what, there can be damages of $1,000, okay, by not cooperating with the release. If the buyer is entitled to cancellation in good faith, then the buyer has every right to collect back their deposit. The seller has no right to use the deposit as hostage, okay? If the buyer did everything correct, and unfortunately that happens, you know, they have a change of heart, they are within their statutory position of contingency period, then you cannot hold the buyer's deposit hostage, okay? Both letters meet the small claim court requirements that a demand may be made from the amount in dispute following a complaint. Absolutely, and I'll explain how that works. You know, if the stubbornness of the seller or the stubbornness of the buyer, then ultimately they can incur additional fines and penalties. But here's the thing, a lot of agents don't understand that. But if you know how to articulate your position, it's a win-win, you know, for your buyer and yourself, okay? Disputes, can escrow help? Well, remember, escrow is a neutral party, neutral. What does that mean? They don't side anyone. Okay, even though you're the listing agent and you have a phenomenal relationship with the escrow officer, the escrow officer has to be biased about the dispute between the buyer and the seller. The escrow officer cannot side for the seller, cannot side for the buyer, even though either may be correct or either are incorrect, or maybe both are correct. The escrow officer cannot be in the middle. Their job is to be the neutral party that is being instructed of what to do, what the buyer instructs and what the seller instructs. That's your job. Their job is to help you close the transaction. That's it. You cannot entangle the escrow officer and involve her in a dispute, okay? But the forms, the BDRD and the SDRD, which is the buyer demand for release of deposit and the seller demand for release of deposit, that's after there's an initial issue that if the close of escrow was today and escrow is not closing today, then either party can send out a demand. Who is delaying the process from closing? And this is, again, makes you an efficient agent when you understand the dynamics of the forms, okay? You gotta understand the bigger picture, okay? The demand to release a deposit can be requested from the buyer or the seller, and that's only after the day of escrow. So if it's a 30-day escrow, ladies and gentlemen, and then 30 days is upon us, this is today, then you have to send out this form. And it may be that the seller is delaying the process, or maybe it's a delay that the buyer is having some issues with the loan and needs more time. You do not want to have this given to you if you represent the buyer, because this gives you a timeline, which is 72 hours to perform. If not, then the seller can go after the buyer's deposit. So to avoid these provisions or these contracts, you got to be proactive. Well, Simon, what do you mean by being proactive? Yeah, if you know that today is the close of escrow, 2-3 days earlier, if you know it's not going to close, then you better be on the phone with the lender saying, hey, what's the status of the loan? Where are we? If you haven't got loan docs, oh my gosh, then you need to be on that phone with the lender and expedite. Where are the conditions? Where are we? Because you may need to do an extension of time to close escrow. And that form is the ETA form, the extension of time addendum, to extend it from ultimately jeopardizing your deposit or your buyer's deposit. So be very careful, ladies and gentlemen. Practice makes you more better at something, right? Just like a football player, basketball player, a soccer player, volleyball player, the more you practice, the better you get at it, okay? So start practicing your craft. Understand the contracts, read them, just like you read a book. Take full advantage of classes like this, to get you in a position of understanding, and reach out to us. We're here for you, okay? All right, so practice notes. Form BDRD, SDRD, make a written demand to escrow for the deposit, paragraph 14H of the RPA. Escrow then delivers notice of demand to the other party. So basically the form stipulates that you send it to escrow, and then escrow will send it to the party that is being served. If it's the buyer being served or if the seller is being served, then what the condition says is that the demand is within 10 days. Escrow may disperse the deposit. It clearly says that on that form, that the escrow has the authority 10 days from the time of this form submitted, that escrow can release the money to whoever requests the deposit. Meaning that if the buyer is within their right, okay, meaning that the buyer did not release all contingencies, right? The buyer has the right to demand the seller to mutually force escrow to release the deposit back to the buyer. As much as the deposit that the seller has the right to send that demand to release the deposit back to the seller, okay, or not back to the seller, but force the buyer to release it to the seller. But here's the thing, and this is where number 2 says escrow sometimes refuses to abide by these procedures. I'm going to tell you that it's not sometimes, okay? It's all the time. They will never. And, since this form was created maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I've never seen an escrow based on this form release this as a condition. Why? Because now the escrow isn't liable. If the escrow releases the money to the wrong party, now they're going to put them in a category of a lawsuit where either party, the buyer or the seller, hires an attorney, and they're gonna question, why did the escrow release the deposit to the buyer or to the seller? Well, escrow was instructed based on the SDRD or the BDRD form. I understand that, but was there mutual agreement? There's the catch-22. Well, there was really not mutual agreement. Therefore, why did you release this? They should have went through arbitration. So this is why, even though there's a contract that allows the seller to demand or the buyer to demand, I have not seen one escrow company release that. And I've seen where escrow has had the buyer's deposit for literally weeks and even months until both buyer and seller come to an agreement. Either one releases, the other releases, or they go into a mediation or escalate it into an arbitration. Oops, okay. All right. Additional resources, okay? All the information can be pulled up from the California Association of Realtors. That's where I get a lot of the information from. Quick guide, liquidated damages. There's also a Q&A on how liquidated damage and deposit disputes work. You know, there's also sample letters that you can utilize through your zip forms, okay? And I'll have a class on that because there's a lot of letters that you can use to alter your position if you represent a buyer, represent a seller. So it's great information to have. You know, and part of all the forms that we just talked about, we talked about the RPA, we talked about the RID, which is the increased deposit. We talked about the demand for deposit for contingency of cancellation. We talked about the demand for deposit buyer failure to close. And then we talked about the two forms, the buyer demand for release of deposit and the seller demand for release of deposit. But you notice that all of them are similarity, and it's between the principal. None of these say anything about the agent, because we should never be entangled in the chaos of a dispute. If there's a dispute, take 2 steps back and let the buyer and seller dispute it amongst each other, okay? You're just navigating the process. You're not in there to defend either or. This is between the buyer and the seller. Because the last thing that you don't want, ladies and gentlemen, is to be in a liability claim. Well, you guide us, you told us what to do, and therefore we lost, we lost a deposit, or we lost, some type of damages here. Okay, this has to be from the buyer and the seller. Never, never, never be the agent. Okay. That concludes my little presentation. Let me just go back real quick to the arbitration. Any questions that we have so far? Any questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to go back to the RID form. So the RID form can be used to increase the liquidated damages over 3%.
Yeah, let me pull it up, Max, and let me show you. So let me go back here. Let me share my computer and go to the form. All right, do you guys see the increased deposit RID form?
Yeah.
Do you see it? Okay. So let me explain how this works. Anytime that the buyer increases their deposit over the 3%, you as a listing agent must provide this form. Because if you do not provide this form, then anything above that 3% has to be returned back to the buyer. But what this form does, Max, this provides a leverage that, okay, I'm good with you increasing your deposit, but I'm also including this provision that if we incorporate the additional increase, we're going to go after that as well. Because what if it's a major project where maybe it's new construction and now the buyer is requesting, upgraded kitchens, countertops, floors, and all this stuff, and that's going to cost 50, 60, 80,000 more. And then the buyer backs out. So what this form allows the consumer is we acknowledge the increase, but we also acknowledge that if the buyer does decide to cancel after releasing any and all contingency and the buyer breaches that contract, then we're going to go for the entire amount. If it's 80,000 in deposit, 100,000, this form protects the seller from that. So now the buyer cannot say, well, per the contract, you only can take up to 3%. I agree, and the contract does define that. But this form alters that position, but here's the key, okay? In looking at this form, it has, the following terms and conditions are incorporated into the California Residential Agreement. whereas the property address, which is 123 ABC Street, between the parties, buyer and seller, my deposit on, which was the date of the original deposit, okay? And then the amount that is currently in escrow, and then ultimately what additional increase, if it's more than the 3%. So let's use the $1 million offer, right? The listing that is $1 million. On the counter offer, I'm requesting that the seller put up to 3%, right? Which means $30,000. So the buyer is in agreement, but then at the last stage, the buyer says, well, you know what, I really want to secure it because there's still multiple offers on the table. We want to increase our deposit in good faith. Then once you execute it, you want to include this. And then whatever the increase you're going to put on section 1 where it says, or a buyer hereby increases the deposit to whatever that amount is, $20,000, $30,000 above the 3%. Now, section number 2 is where you need to understand, okay? Number 2 is because the language already says just below where it says if buyer fails to complete the purchase because of buyer's default, seller shall retain the deposit actually paid, right? Just similar to what it says on the RPA. Then it goes to say that, you know, then the amount retained shall not be more than 3%, which is again, what's the purpose of this agreement if they're only able to get 3%? Here's what you need to check. You need to check is not hereby incorporated. So what that means is when you check this off, the seller can go now after that $100,000 deposit. So the 3% is out of question now because the buyer or the seller agreed to check this off. If buyer and seller have agreed to the liquidated damages in this agreement, the following liquidated damages provision is or is not hereby incorporated and made part of this agreement or addendum. If you leave this blank and no check, then it incorporates the original terms of the RPA, meaning that the seller can only go after 3%. By checking this, now you're telling the buyer, we're going to go after even more than 3%, whatever is in escrow. So if escrow has $50,000 or $100,000 and the seller has the buyer sign because both mutually have to agree to this, okay? And it says the undersigned have read and acknowledged receipt of a copy of this increased deposit. And both the seller and the buyer have to agree to it. And if there's no agreement, then it's not a binding agreement. Make sense? Does that answer your question, Max?
Simon?
Yes. Hi, Max. Hello? Max? Hi, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me? Oh boy, okay. Max? I think I lost Max. Can anyone hear me on this call?
I can hear you, Simon.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so it's not me. All right, so it must be Max is having some issues. He probably had a bad connection. Anyways, I hope that kind of answers the questions regarding the increase of liquidated damages. All right. Any other questions?
Simon, I have a question. This is Miguel.
Hey, Miguel.
So yeah, I appreciate the clarity on the RID. So basically, it's allowing your buyer to be more vulnerable, with a bigger deposit, for whatever reason. If you're asking for that, or for me, maybe you want to make your deal stronger. Is that right?
That is correct. So, you know, right now what we're dealing with is obviously very shortage of properties on the market, right? So what is happening, there's a frenzy of buyers that are submitting ridiculous offers, right? They're making offers way above list price, you know, sometimes 50, sometimes even 100,000, depending on the area. It's a supply and demand, right? low inventory, lots of buyers, very low properties. So what's happening is buyers are trying to beat other buyers by giving their best offers and terms. So what's happening is, to showcase your position, this may be a leverage on your part, meaning that, it can also be your price, but it also can be your conditions, the terms of the agreement. So here's one thing that I've seen that works very effective. And how it works effective is maybe increasing your deposit. Now there's two sections to the deposit. There's the section of the deposit, and then there's a section of the increased deposit, which is like, I think paragraph 4 or 5 of the first page of the RPA. That already says that, the buyer is willing to put, X amount of money in deposit, but maybe on a later day and time, they're willing to increase it as an avenue of negotiation. Well, remember, what are you trying to accomplish here? You're trying to accomplish that the seller gives you the opportunity to get your offer considered. Now, the seller is going to look at many factors, not always the price, but it's also the terms. And this is where you have to be a very diligent agent, ask a lot of questions to the listing agent. Well, and we can role play real quick and say something to the nature is, well, Mr. and Mrs. Listing Agent, what are we trying to accomplish here, right? Can you tell me, does the seller need a rent back? Do they need a shorter escrow or longer escrow? Are they looking at price, or are they looking at conditions? Are they looking at the down payment as an aggressor position over other offers? So these are questions you want to be asking the listing agent to get a little bit of intel. And I hope that the listing agent is giving you this information because, one, you wanna position yourself that you want your offer to be considered and ultimately get your buyer in escrow. But if there's no dialogue or no conversations over that, then unfortunately you may not have that opportunity, and therefore your offer may not be considered. Okay, so this is just another leverage that you use, Miguel. Okay. All right, Max, you're back on the call. So as I was saying, I hope that was clarity in your position, Max. Okay, awesome. Any other questions? I know we're also live on Facebook, so I cannot see what's on Facebook, but any additional questions, you can always email me. So that concludes our class. Thank you. Yes.
Do we have time for one more?
Yes, sir.
All right. So does the buyer usually need to justify up to 3% of damages? Or I mean the seller. If the seller's looking to say the buyer fails and the seller wants 3%, wants to hang on to that 3%, does it always need to be justified? Or is that just a way of going about reducing that loss, for your buyer?
That's a very good question, Miguel. And it really all depends. If the buyer doesn't challenge it, then by all means, the seller can go after the full 3%. It's only when the buyer challenges that and says, no, seller, I am not going to give you the full 3%. Then when there is a challenge, then ultimately that stops everything. If the buyer does not challenge it, then there is no recourse. The buyer will ultimately end up losing the 3%. And if there is a RID form, the increase of deposit, buyer may be in jeopardy of even losing more than the 3%. So be very, very careful. Now, I know it's a very competitive market right now, but you got to think outside the box. But knowing how to navigate these contracts will give you that upper leverage to get your offer at least considered, folks. And that's all I'm saying. Whatever avenue, as long as you educate your clients and have them understand of what they're doing, because it's not your money, okay? It's not the listing agent's money. It's still not the seller's money yet until it's officially, executed. Then, there may be recourse if the buyer breaches the contract. Now the seller may be able to go after the deposit. Okay. So hopefully that answers your question. Any other questions? Awesome, Miguel. Good question, by the way. All right. So that concludes. I did go over my initial time, but thank you for being on the call, guys. Every Tuesday, 2 p.m., we have these classes, okay, case studies. So next week, I'll have another topic that we'll bring to the table, and love the Q&A, the questions being brought up to me as an avenue to, you know, educate you more on it, okay? And then just as a reminder, tomorrow we do have a team meeting at 12 o'clock, and then right after follow-up at 1 o'clock, we have our St. Patrick's event, okay? We're gonna have food, some drinks here for the ones that do wanna come and participate. Obviously, we're gonna be practicing our safe 6 feet apart. Masks are obviously required, but love to see you here or also on Zoom as well. All right. Thanks again. I appreciate all of you. Stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll see you on the next Zoom call. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
I
you,
appreciate
Simon.
it.